80 guests had just finished singing when Chidi pulled a second ultrasound from his jacket and raised it high. "This," he said, "is the child carrying my name, and the mother is standing right there." He pointed at a shanty near the gift table. The room broke. A scream, a chair dragged. Someone rushed forward, but Eshe didn't move. Her fingers slid to the sapphire ring, the one she'd started wearing again 3 days ago, then lowered, slow and deliberate, to the cake table, just above the box. Her eyes met her mother's. One small, steady nod. The pink hydrangeas were still fresh. Gold tablecloths caught the late afternoon light. A 3-tier cake sat untouched at the center table, white frosting dotted with tiny sugar flowers, and the name Baby Okafor written in soft lavender script. 80 people filled the rented garden hall. Aunties in their Sunday hats, co-workers from Eshe's school, college friends, church members, cousins who'd driven in from 3 states. The decorations smelled like vanilla and ribbon. The air smelled like love. Every chair faced the front, where Eshe sat in the decorated mother's chair. Belly round, skin glowing under 8 months of life growing inside her, wearing a white dress Ruth Ann had picked out herself. A crown of silk flowers rested on her head. She looked like peace. Ruth Ann, Eshe's mother, had organized every detail. The menu, the playlist, the guest list. She'd spent 2 months turning that garden hall into a place where her daughter could feel held by every woman who'd ever loved her. And for the first 90 minutes, it worked. Laughter filled the room. Stories were told. Blessings were spoken. Gifts were stacked in towers of pastel paper. Someone cried while reading a card. Someone else sang. Then Chidi stood up. He'd been sitting near the back with his arms crossed, phone face down on his thigh, watching the room with the loose patience of a man waiting for his turn. When the MC handed him the microphone for the father's toast, a few women clapped. Someone whispered, "Here we go." They expected something sweet, something about fatherhood, something about Eshe. Chidi adjusted his collar, took a breath, and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded ultrasound, not the one framed at the front table beside the baby shoes. A different one. He unfolded it slowly, raised it above his head, and let the room see it. The paper trembled between his fingers, not from nerves, but from the kind of certainty that only lives inside a man who's already decided to burn his own house down. "This," he said, voice steady, microphone close, "is the child that will carry my name. And the mother is standing right there." He pointed at Ashanti. She stood near the gift table, close enough to touch the stacked boxes, close enough to be part of the event, but far enough to seem like a +1. Someone's co-worker, maybe. Someone's cousin. Nobody had questioned her being there, but now, under the weight of Chidi's pointed finger, she stepped forward. 1 step, 2. Her hand moved to her stomach, not quite showing yet, but enough. She wore a fitted burgundy dress, gold earrings, lips slightly parted. And when she looked at Eshe, she didn't flinch. She tilted her chin up and smiled, slow, deliberate, like a woman who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. "I just thought you should hear it from him," Ashanti said, "instead of the streets." The room shattered. A scream came from somewhere near the back. Eshe's cousin Nadine on her feet before the sound left her throat. A chair scraped tile. Eshe's sister Wanda lunged forward, arm outstretched, voice cracking. "Are you out of your mind?" Ruth Ann's hand slammed flat on the table, rattling the silverware. But she didn't stand. Not yet. Her eyes locked on her daughter. And Eshe, 8 months pregnant, sitting in a chair decorated with pink ribbons and paper butterflies, did not move. Her chest rose once, fell. Her hands stayed in her lap. Her right thumb slid across the sapphire ring on her finger, the ring her grandmother had given her the day she got engaged, the one Chidi used to kiss and call the mark of a real woman, the one she'd stopped wearing 4 months ago and slipped back on, quietly 3 days before this shower. She turned it once, twice. Then her hand drifted down, slow, careful, like she was reaching for something beneath the surface of everything, and stopped just above the box, taped beneath the edge of the cake table. Her eyes found her mother's. One nod, small, steady. Not yet. 80 people in that room believed they were watching a woman's world collapse in real time. They believed Eshe was in shock, frozen, broken. But Eshe's hand wasn't trembling because she was falling apart. It was steady because she had been waiting for this exact moment for 4 weeks. They met at a community fundraiser 3 years before that baby shower. Chidi was running a table near the entrance, collecting donations for a neighborhood youth center, wearing a navy blazer with the sleeves pushed up, laughing with every person who walked past. He had the kind of charm that made people feel chosen, not impressed, but seen. He remembered names. He remembered details. He asked questions that made women answer longer than they planned to. Eshe was volunteering at the food station. She didn't notice him at first. She was too busy making sure the foil trays stayed warm and the napkin stacks didn't collapse. But Chidi noticed her. He walked over with 2 cups of lemonade and said, "You look like the kind of woman who makes sure everything's perfect before she takes a single bite." She looked at him, took the cup, and said, "That's because I am." They were married within a year. The wedding was small. 40 guests, a garden ceremony at Ruth Ann's church, Isha in a simple ivory dress with her grandmother's sapphire ring catching the afternoon light every time she moved her hand. Chidi cried during the vows. Real tears, the kind that roll slow and catch the light and make every woman in the pews believe they're witnessing something sacred. Ruth Ann sat in the front row, watching. She clapped when everyone else clapped. She smiled when everyone else smiled. But later, while folding towels in the kitchen, she told Eshe quietly, "A man who talks that smooth to everybody don't always save his best words for one woman." Eshe laughed it off. She was in love. And Chidi, in those early months, gave her every reason to be. He kissed her hand every morning before she left for school. She taught 3rd grade at a public elementary in the east end of the city, the kind of classroom where half the kids came hungry and all of them left knowing someone believed in them. He brought her flowers on Tuesdays because she once told him Tuesdays were her hardest days. Parent conferences, staff meetings, the weight of other people's children sitting on her shoulders. He held the sapphire ring up to the window light one Sunday morning, turning her hand gently in his, and said, "This ring found the right woman." She believed him. She had no reason not to. The first year was good, honest, full of quiet dinners where their forks clinked in rhythm, loud laughter over bad movies on the couch, and the kind of weekends where nothing needed to happen because being together was enough. They painted the spare bedroom together on a Saturday, got more paint on each other than the walls, and ended up ordering pizza on the floor surrounded by drop cloths. That was the marriage Eshe carried in her chest, the one she kept returning to long after the real one stopped looking like it. Chidi's small real estate company started growing in the 2nd year. 2 agents became 6, then 10. He opened a 2nd office across town in a glass front building with his name etched on the door. Started wearing new suits, slim cut, dark, the kind that cost more than their first month's rent. Started leaving dinner early to take calls in the other room with the door closed. Started coming home smelling like a restaurant Eshe had never been to. Eshe noticed the shifts before they became patterns. A phone kept face down on the nightstand. A gym bag that smelled like cologne instead of sweat. Late nights explained with new vocabulary. Investor calls, client mixers, networking events. Words that arrived fully formed, rehearsed, polished, smooth enough to slide past without friction. She didn't question it at first. She trusted the man she married. She trusted the hands that held hers every Sunday morning in the church pew. She trusted the tears she'd watched fall from his eyes at the altar. But then came the comments. It started small. You could put in a little more effort, Esha. She was standing at the stove, stirring soup 8 hours into her teaching day, feet aching inside shoes she'd been meaning to replace for 3 months. She looked at him. He didn't look up from his phone. She waited for him to say something else, something that would soften the edge of what he'd just said. He didn't. A week later, louder. You're comfortable. That's your problem. You settled into being ordinary. He said it while pulling on his jacket, already halfway out the door. Like it was a fact, like it was a diagnosis. She set down the spoon, stared at the back of his head as the door closed, and said nothing. But something behind her eyes shifted. A quiet rearrangement, the kind nobody sees, the kind that only matters later. The name Ashanti Wells appeared on a bank statement 2 months after that. It was listed under consulting fees, $4,200 paid to an LLC called Wells Strategic Marketing. Ishi asked about it one evening while they were cleaning the kitchen, her hands still wet from rinsing plates. Chidi's jaw tightened. His fingers stopped moving on the counter. She's a marketing contractor. Stop acting insecure. His voice had a wall behind it. Not anger exactly, but the sound of a door being closed from the inside. Eshe didn't ask again. But she noticed that the payments didn't stop. They grew. $4,200 became $6,500, became $8,000 in a single month. She noticed that Chidi's phone now had a passcode it didn't have before, that he took it into the bathroom, that he angled the screen away from her, even when he was just checking the weather. And she noticed that Sunday dinners at Ruth Ann's house, the ones Chidi used to insist on attending, the ones where he'd carve the chicken and tell jokes and call Ruth Ann Mama Ruth, quietly disappeared from his calendar. 1 week missed, then 2, then gone. She took the sapphire ring off one night while Chidi was asleep beside her. The bedroom was dark. The only sound was his breathing, steady, unbothered, the sleep of a man with nothing on his conscience. She slid the ring from her finger, held it in her palm for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the coolness of the stone, the history folded into its setting. Then she placed it in her velvet jewelry box, closed the lid softly, and didn't tell anyone why. Ruth Ann noticed within a week. She didn't ask about the ring directly. That wasn't Ruth Ann's way. She sat beside Esh on the couch one Saturday afternoon, coffee in both their hands, and said, "A man who stops looking at you has started looking somewhere else." Ishi pressed her lips together and changed the subject to the school fundraiser. But she heard it. She stored it in the same quiet place where she'd been storing everything else. And somewhere deep beneath her silence, she began watching more carefully than anyone in her life had ever given her credit for. One evening, while looking for a pen in Chidi's home office, Eshe opened the wrong drawer. Inside was a folder with a blue cover and a label typed in small print, Okafor Wells Property Group, LLC. Ashanti's name was listed as co-managing partner. Beneath it, a property address Eshe had never heard of, a signature line with Chidi's handwriting, and a date from 6 months prior. Eshe stared at it for 9 seconds. Her breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. She memorized the address. Then she closed the drawer and walked out of the office like she'd never been in it. The discovery came 6 months into her pregnancy, on a Tuesday. Her hardest day, the day Chidi once brought her flowers for. She found his second phone in his gym bag. Not hidden well, tucked between a rolled towel and a pair of compression shorts, screen still warm. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone balanced on her palm, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. She entered his birthday as the passcode. It opened. The messages between Chidi and Ashanti went back 7 months, not just romantic, strategic. Plans for property acquisitions, budget projections. A shared spreadsheet tracking revenue from 2 rental properties Eshe didn't know existed. Chidi had been funneling marital funds, quietly, steadily, $8,000 to $12,000 at a time, into a joint LLC with Ashanti. The total, based on the spreadsheet, exceeded $140,000. But the deeper wound came 3 scrolls later. Between Chidi's messages and Ashanti's flirtations, there was a third voice. A group chat, and the name at the top of it made Eshe's breath stop. Yolanda. Yolanda. Her best friend since their sophomore year at Howard. The woman who'd held her hair during her first hangover, and cried at her wedding and threw the gender reveal party, and texted her, "Good morning, beautiful," every single day. Yolanda had been feeding Chidi information for months, telling him when Eshe was suspicious, coaching him on what to say to keep her calm, warning him when Eshe mentioned the bank statements. And 3 weeks before the baby shower, Yolanda had helped Ashanti choose the burgundy dress, the one she wore tonight, texting, "Wear something classy. Don't give nobody a reason to look twice. We keeping this smooth." Eshe sat on the bathroom floor, 7 months pregnant, both hands around the phone, the tiles cold beneath her bare legs. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. She did not throw the phone or scream into a pillow or break a glass. She breathed in, breathed out. Then she began screenshotting every message, every transfer receipt, every group chat reply, every flirtatious photograph. She forwarded them all to a new email address she created right there on the bathroom floor, ashowcarfor.truth@gmail.com. Then she put the phone back exactly where she found it. Towel rolled, shorts folded, zipper closed. The next morning she drove to Ruth Ann's house. She placed her own phone on the kitchen table, opened the email and said, "Mama, I need you to see something, and I need you to not react until I finish talking." Ruth Ann read everything. Her hands shook. Her jaw tightened until a vein appeared beneath her ear. When she finished, she looked up at her daughter with eyes that carried the kind of fury only a mother can hold without breaking. Ishi said, "I'm not going to fall apart. I'm going to wait, and when the time is right, I'm going to let them destroy themselves." Ruth Ann set down the phone, folded her hands and said, "Tell me what you need." That same night, Eshe pulled up the LLC operating agreement she'd photographed from Chidi's office months earlier. She read every clause, and on page 11 she found it. A provision stating that if the business entity was formed using misrepresented or fraudulently transferred marital assets, the agreement could be voided in its entirety, and the contributing spouse held liable for restitution. Eshe read that clause 3 times. Then she saved it in a separate folder and closed her laptop. She didn't know yet exactly how she would use it, but she knew it would matter, and she was willing to wait. Over the next 3 weeks, Eshe moved like water through stone, quiet, steady, reshaping everything without being seen. She consulted a family attorney named Pamela Grant, a woman from Ruth Ann's church who'd spent 20 years handling divorces the community never talked about. Pamela reviewed the screenshots, the financial records, and the LLC filing. She sat back in her chair and said, "He moved marital money into a joint venture with his mistress. That's not just adultery. That's financial fraud against the marriage." Eshe asked her to prepare 3 things: divorce papers, a forensic financial summary tracing every dollar diverted from the marriage, and a formal legal notice to void the Okafor Wells LLC under the fraud clause. Pamela worked quickly. Everything was ready in 10 days. Meanwhile, Ishi became a mirror. She cooked dinner, asked about Chidi's day, laughed at his jokes. She even complimented a new shirt he'd bought. The kind of shirt a man only buys when someone else is looking at him. Chidi relaxed. He texted Ashanti openly at the dinner table. He stopped locking his phone. He started leaving the house without excuses. Confidence made him careless. Carelessness made him blind. Eshe called Yolanda the next day and asked her to help finalize the baby shower seating chart. Yolanda agreed instantly. Voice bright, helpful, eager. Girl, I've got you. Just tell me who sits where. Ishi smiled into the phone and said, I'm putting you at the table right next to the cake. Yolanda laughed. She didn't understand the weight of what she'd just accepted. Ruth Ann, under Isha's quiet direction, personally added 3 names to the baby shower guest list. Mr. Leonard Price, Chidi's biggest real estate investor, the man who had funded the next 2 property deals. Mrs. Clarice Okafor, Chidi's mother, a proud woman who had told everyone at church her son was the most faithful man she'd ever raised. And Deacon Jerome Watkins, head of the church board where Chidi served, the same man who had publicly praised Chidi as a role model for young husbands. Ruth Ann called each of them personally, made sure they confirmed, made sure they would be seated near the front with clear sight lines to the center of the room. 3 days before the shower, Ishi opened her velvet jewelry box and lifted out the sapphire ring. She turned it under the bedroom light, slid it onto her finger, pressed it against her lips. That evening, Chidi noticed. He paused at the doorway of the kitchen and said, You're wearing that old thing again. Ishi looked at him, smiled, and said, It reminded me of who I am. The morning of the shower, Eshe arrived at the garden hall before anyone else. She placed a manila envelope inside a decorative box, the kind that looked like it belonged on a gift table. Inside the envelope, the signed divorce papers, the forensic financial summary, and the legal notice voiding the LLC. She taped the box to the underside of the cake table, hidden behind the tablecloth, out of sight, but exactly where her hand could reach it from the mother's chair. Then she arranged the flowers, set out the place cards, adjusted the ribbon on the archway, and waited. The shower began at 2 o'clock. Guests arrived in waves, hugs at the door, trays passed hand to hand, chairs filling with laughter and perfume. Eshe stood near the entrance and greeted every person by name. She hugged her cousin Nadine. She kissed Deacon Watkins on the cheek. She shook Mr. Price's hand warmly. She held Mrs. Okafor's hands and said, I'm so glad you're here. She saved Yolanda for last. Yolanda came through the door carrying a gift bag in each hand, wearing a wide smile that showed every tooth. Girl, she said, pulling Eshe into a hug. You look like a queen. Eshe hugged her back, held the embrace 1 second longer than natural. Yolanda stiffened, just slightly, not enough to understand, but enough to feel. Eshe whispered, I'm glad you came. Chidi arrived 30 minutes late, phone in hand, sunglasses pushed onto his forehead. He kissed Eshe on the cheek without looking at her and walked to the back of the room. Nobody said anything, but a few of the older women exchanged glances. Ashanti arrived separately. She blended in near the gift table, standing beside 2 other women who assumed she was someone's +1. She wore the burgundy dress, the one Yolanda had helped her choose. Gold earrings, flat expression. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't need to. She was waiting too. Eshe noticed her the moment she walked in. She didn't turn her head. She didn't adjust her posture, but her right hand moved beneath the table, brushing the edge of the box, and then returned to her lap. Ruth Ann, standing near the dessert station, saw the motion and nodded. For the next hour, the shower unfolded beautifully. Games, gifts, prayers. Eshe opened each present with both hands, smiling, laughing, thanking every guest. She held up tiny onesies and matching socks and a hand-knitted blanket from one of the church mothers. She pressed her hand against her belly when someone spoke a blessing over the baby. She was radiant. But those watching closely noticed one thing. Eshe never once looked at Chidi, not when he laughed too loud near the bar, not when he leaned against the wall and scrolled his phone, not when he whispered something to Ashanti near the hallway, his hand briefly touching the small of her back. Eshe saw it all, and she said nothing. Every few minutes her fingers moved to the sapphire ring, turning it slowly, like a woman counting down. When the MC called Chidi up for the father's toast, the room settled into that warm, expectant hush. Chidi stood, adjusted his jacket, took the microphone, smiled, and Eshe's hand moved, not to her glass, not to her belly, to the edge of the cake table, just above the box. The silence after Chidi's announcement lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds where the only sound was the hum of the garden hall's overhead fans and the muffled gasp of 80 people trying to decide whether they'd heard what they thought they'd heard. Then the room exploded. Nadine was on her feet, chair kicked back, voice rising above the noise. "You did not just—" Wanda grabbed Chidi's arm and was pulled away by her husband. Mrs. Okafor's mouth hung open, one hand frozen over her chest. Deacon Watkins removed his glasses and placed them on the table, slowly, like a man watching a car wreck he couldn't stop. Ashanti stood in the center of it all, chin lifted, one hand resting on her belly, the other hanging loose at her side. She looked at Eshe with an expression that wasn't sympathy or guilt or shame. It was satisfaction, and every woman in that room felt it. Chidi still held the microphone. He scanned the crowd like he expected applause, or at least understanding. When neither came, he shrugged and said, "I'm just being honest. Y'all always talking about honesty." But Eshe hadn't moved. Not during the announcement. Not during the screaming. Not during any of it. She sat in her decorated chair, both hands in her lap, breathing steady, watching the chaos like a woman watching weather from behind glass. And then, when the volume dropped just enough for a voice to cut through, Ruth Ann stood. Not fast. Not furious. She rose from her chair the way a woman stands in church before she speaks a word that changes the room. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded at her waist. And every person who knew Ruth Ann, every church member, every neighbor, every cousin, went silent. Because when Ruth Ann stood, you listened. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. "Before anyone leaves this room," Ruth Ann said, her voice low and steady and full of a calm that could cut steel, "my daughter has something she'd like to share." The room stilled. Chidi's smirk faded at the edges. Ashanti's hand tightened on her stomach. Eshe stood, slowly, one hand on her belly, supporting the weight, the other reaching beneath the cake table, pulling the decorative box free from the underside of the cloth. She set it on the table, opened it, removed the manila envelope, and placed 3 documents, one by one, on the table beside the untouched cake. She spoke without raising her voice, without shaking, without a single tear. "I've known about Ashanti for 4 months. I've known about the baby for 3. And I've known about the LLC you opened together using money from our marriage. For 2. The room didn't gasp this time. It froze. The kind of freeze that happens when the ground shifts beneath your feet and your body hasn't caught up yet. Eshe turned to Yolanda. "And I've known that my best friend has been helping you hide all of it." Yolanda's face collapsed. Not slowly. It fell, like the muscles behind her expression gave out all at once. She stood from her chair near the cake table, mouth opening, hands rising, but nothing came out. No excuse, no denial, no sound. Just the hollow expression of a woman who'd been standing in the dark and someone had just turned the lights on. Eshe turned back to Chidi. She tapped the first document. "Divorce papers. Already filed." She tapped the second. "A forensic financial report showing $140,000 in marital funds you transferred into a joint LLC with your mistress." She tapped the third. "A legal notice voiding the Okafor Wells LLC. Your own operating agreement says if the entity was formed using misrepresented marital assets, the entire agreement can be voided. Your attorney wrote that clause, Chidi. Not mine." Chidi stepped forward. His hand shot out for the papers. Ishi pulled them back, 1 inch, without flinching. "These are copies. The originals are already with my attorney." She turned to Mr. Leonard Price, seated 3 chairs from the front. "Mr. Price, you should know that the property venture Chidi pitched to you last month was funded with money taken from his pregnant wife's household accounts." Mr. Price's jaw set like stone. His hand moved to the financial report. He didn't ask permission. He picked it up and started reading. She turned to Mrs. Okafor. "I loved your son. I truly did. But I won't let him take my peace, my money, or my name." Mrs. Okafor didn't speak. Her hand fell from her chest to her lap. Her chin dropped. She looked at Chidi with something worse than anger. She looked at him like she didn't recognize him. Eshe turned to Deacon Watkins. "Deacon, I'll leave it to the church to decide what to do with a man who stood in the pulpit every Sunday while building a second life on lies." Deacon Watkins folded his glasses into his breast pocket and nodded once. That was all. Then Eshe did something the room didn't expect. She reached for the sapphire ring on her right hand. She didn't yank it. She didn't throw it. She slid it off, slowly, the way you close a book you've finished, and placed it on the table beside the documents. The ring sat there, catching the light, surrounded by legal paper and the crumbs of a celebration that had turned into something else entirely. "My grandmother gave me this ring the day I got engaged," Eshe said. "She told me, wear it as long as you're loved. Take it off the day you remember you don't need it." She looked at Chidi, held his gaze without blinking. "I remember." Silence. Total, absolute. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it empties it. 80 people sat in that garden hall, and not one of them breathed loud enough to hear. Ashanti's smile was gone. Her hand had dropped from her stomach. She looked at Chidi, not with love or loyalty, but with the sharp, sudden understanding of a woman who had just realized she had chosen the wrong side. Chidi's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand still hung in the air where the papers had been. His fingers closed on empty space. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came the way weather comes. First a wind, then a chill, then the storm. Mr. Leonard Price pulled his investment within 48 hours. No phone call, no meeting, just an email to Chidi's business address with one line. "Effective immediately. I'm withdrawing all committed capital from current and future ventures." Chidi called him 6 times. Mr. Price answered none. On the 7th call, Price's assistant picked up. She said, "Mr. Price has asked me to let you know that further contact should go through his attorney." Then the line went dead. Chidi sat in his office chair and stared at the screen for a long time. The email stayed open. He read it again and again, as if reading it one more time might change the words. The LLC was voided the following week. Pamela Grant filed the notice and copied Ashanti's attorney, a man who, upon reviewing the evidence, advised Ashanti to cooperate fully and distance herself from the agreement immediately. The 2 rental properties purchased with marital funds were flagged for reassessment by the court. Chidi's company, already stretched thin from overexpansion and fueled by money that was never his alone, began hemorrhaging cash. 2 of his agents resigned within the month. A third stopped returning calls. The glass front office with his name etched on the door still stood, but the parking lot out front grew emptier every week. Ashanti confronted Chidi at his office 3 days after the shower. She'd come for reassurance, wearing the same gold earrings from the baby shower, her face set in the same confidence she'd carried into that garden hall. But the man behind the desk wasn't the man who'd pointed at her and called her the mother of his heir. This man was surrounded by spreadsheets and legal letters and the wreckage of a plan that had collapsed the moment a pregnant woman in a white dress stood up and said 4 sentences. His voice was flat and cold. "You were supposed to be the upgrade," he said without looking up. Not the liability. Ashanti stared at him. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly. The belly he'd raised an ultrasound for, the belly he'd used as a weapon in front of 80 people. She waited for him to take it back. He didn't. She turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Not slammed, just closed, and the sound of her heels faded down the hallway into nothing. She would call him 11 more times over the next month. He would answer twice. Both conversations lasted less than 3 minutes. Yolanda sent 14 text messages to Esha over the next 2 weeks. The first 3 were apologies. Long, rambling, full of, "You have to understand," and "I never meant for it to go this far." The next 5 were explanations, each one longer than the last, each one circling closer to the truth without ever landing on it. The last 6 were please. "Just call me," the final one read. "Please, I can't lose you." Eshi read every single one. She opened each message, let the read receipt turn blue, and closed her phone. She never replied. Not once. And the silence was surgical. Yolanda's name disappeared from group chats she'd been part of for a decade. Her calls went unanswered by women who used to answer on the first ring. Invitations stopped arriving. Nobody confronted her. Nobody argued. Nobody said a cruel word. They simply stopped including her. And the silence that followed was louder than anything anyone could have said. Mrs. Okafor called Esha on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the shower. Her voice was quiet, careful, worn thin by something that sounded like shame, but might have been grief. The grief of a mother who had raised a son and watched him become someone she didn't recognize. She asked Esha to reconsider, to give Chidi time, to give the family a chance to mend. As she listened, she didn't interrupt. She held the phone against her ear and let Mrs. Okafor finish every sentence, every pause, every, "But he's still your husband." When Mrs. Okafor was done, as she said, "I respect you, Mrs. Okafor. I always have. But your son made his choice in front of 80 people. I'm making mine in private." The line went quiet for a long time. Then Mrs. Okafor said, "God bless you, child," and hung up. Deacon Watkins raised the matter at the next church board meeting on a Tuesday evening. The discussion lasted 40 minutes. 3 board members spoke. 2 of them had been at the baby shower. The third had heard about it from his wife, who had heard about it from her sister, who had been sitting in the second row when Chidi raised that ultrasound. Chidi was asked to step down from his leadership role. He didn't fight it. He didn't show up to hear the decision. His chair sat empty at the table, and nobody moved it. Nobody even looked at it. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday night after 9 o'clock, Chidi showed up at Esha's door. The porch light was on. Ruth Ann had installed a new one the week before, brighter, with a motion sensor. It clicked on the moment Chidi stepped onto the concrete path. He stood on the other side of the screen door, hands in his pockets, shoulders lower than she'd ever seen them. His suit was the same cut he'd always worn, but it didn't fit the same way. Something had shifted beneath the fabric. Not weight, but posture. The posture of a man who had walked into his own consequences and found them heavier than he expected. He said her name like it was a question, like he wasn't sure it still belonged to him. She opened the inner door, looked at him through the mesh. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically. Something behind his eyes had contracted, pulled inward, like the architecture of who he thought he was had begun folding in on itself. His hands came out of his pockets and hung at his sides, empty. "Eshe," he said again. "Can we talk? Just 5 minutes." She held the door handle with one hand. The other rested on her belly, the belly that was now bigger, lower, closer to the day their daughter would arrive. "You can see your child when the court says you can," she said. Her voice was even. Not cruel, not cold, just finished. The way a book sounds when you reach the last page and close the cover and set it on the shelf. Good night, Chidi. She closed the door, turned the lock, walked back to the kitchen where a cup of tea was still warm on the counter, and didn't look back. 4 months later, the tan line on Escher's right hand where the sapphire ring used to sit had almost faded. Almost. If you looked closely in certain light, you could still see the faint outline, a thin, pale stripe circling the base of her ring finger, the ghost of something that used to live there. Some mornings, when the light hit her hand just right, pouring orange through the kitchen window while she poured coffee, she noticed it and paused. Not with sadness, not with anger, with the quiet recognition of a woman looking at the place where a wound used to be and realizing the skin had grown back stronger. She'd moved into a small apartment near Ruth Ann's house. 2 bedrooms, morning light in every window, a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and dish soap and the lavender she kept in a jar on the counter. The walls were bare at first, but slowly she filled them. A print of sunflowers from a Saturday market, a framed photograph of her grandmother, a crayon drawing from one of her 3rd graders that read, "Miss Escher is the best." The space was small. It was hers, and that was enough. Her daughter, Amara, had been born 3 weeks after the baby shower. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark curls, and a cry that filled the hospital room like a song nobody had written yet. Esche held her for 40 minutes before letting anyone else touch her. Ruth Ann stood at the bedside, hands clasped, tears rolling freely down her cheeks, whispering, "There she is, there she is." When Esche finally placed Amara in her mother's arms, Ruth Ann looked down at the baby and then up at her daughter and said, "She's got your grandmother's eyes." And Esche, exhausted and swollen and more at peace than she'd been in 2 years, closed her eyes and smiled. Now, on a Saturday morning in early October, Esche sat on Ruth Ann's front porch. The air was warm, but moving. That soft, end-of-summer breeze that carries the first whisper of fall and makes the leaves turn their pale undersides toward the sky. Amara slept on her chest, one tiny hand curled around the collar of Esche's shirt, breathing in the slow, untroubled rhythm that only newborns know. Ruth Ann sat beside her in the next chair, peeling oranges into a ceramic bowl, her fingers working the rind in a single, continuous spiral, the way she'd done since Esche was a girl watching from the kitchen floor. Neither woman spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was the kind that only comes when 2 people have walked through something terrible together and found the other side, not unscathed, not unmarked, but standing. On the bookshelf inside Esche's apartment, the sapphire ring sat in its velvet box, not hidden, not thrown away, kept, because the ring was never about Chidi. It was never about a marriage or a man or a promise made at an altar. It was about her grandmother, about the line of women before her who had worn it and set it down and picked themselves up and kept walking, about knowing when to hold on and when to let go, and having the strength to tell the difference. Esche lifted her coffee cup with her free hand, took a sip, set it down on the wide arm of the wooden chair. The porch creaked softly beneath her weight. A cardinal landed on the railing, tilted its head toward the baby, and flew off into the oaks. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's sprinkler hissed against the sidewalk. A screen door closed. A dog barked once and went quiet. Ruth Ann held up a perfect spiral of orange peel. "Look at that," she said quietly. "One piece." Esche smiled. "You always could do that." Ruth Ann set the peel in the bowl and reached over to touch her daughter's shoulder. Just a touch. Light. Brief. The kind of touch that says everything without a single word. Esche closed her eyes. The sun pressed warm against her bare hand. The hand that used to wear a sapphire ring. The hand that had reached beneath a cake table and changed the shape of her own life. Amara shifted on her chest and sighed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Esche felt the kind of quiet that doesn't come from the absence of noise. but from the presence of peace. Some women fight with fire. Eshe fought with patience, proof, and a plan that didn't need a single raised voice. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is built for the women who chose their peace over someone else's chaos.